A black girl quietly walked into Brighton High School. Her name was Monique Jones, and she was here to complete her senior year in silence, blending invisibly among the crowded hallways. But before Monique could memorize the locker combination, Ava Moore, a white girl with porcelain skin and a heart as cold as ice, decided that Monique would be the perfect target for bullying. It started with mocking laughs, followed by malicious whispers, and then intentional acts of humiliation in front of everyone. And when Ava smiled confidently, thinking she was about to deliver the final performance, the whole school gathered, phones ready to record, waiting for the moment when Monique would break. But there was one thing that none of them knew about Monique Jones. She wasn't just some quiet new girl from Chicago. They had unwittingly picked a fight with a trained fighter, someone who had spent her entire childhood honing discipline and self-control in her father's gym. And today, Monique was going to show them all exactly what that meant. The yellow bus stopped in front of Brighton High. The students quickly poured out, making noise as they went. Monique Jones was the last to get off, clutching the straps of her backpack tightly, trying to avoid the scrutinizing gazes of those around her. Monique was familiar with those looks. As a black girl who had transferred schools multiple times, she knew that wherever she went, her presence was always met with a silent sea of unasked questions. This girl from Chicago, in the eyes of others, was always an enigma. People were not just curious about her unfamiliar face, but also about the stark contrast in her skin color in a school where most of the students were white. She looked up at the large red brick building of Brighton High. The dull gray windows, the narrow hallways packed with people, all of it looked exactly like the schools she had been to before. Nothing new, nothing surprising. Monique had been to enough schools, enough towns, to understand one unspoken truth. Move quietly. Leave no trace. Don't attract attention. That was the only way she knew how to protect herself. Monique tightened her grip on her backpack straps, beginning to blend into the stream of students pouring into the school. She moved slowly but steadily, trying not to brush against anyone, avoiding any gaze that might meet hers. But no matter how hard she tried, Monique still caught glimpses of quick, curious stares mixed with doubt. A few whispers passed by her ears, soft and low, but clear in their intent. Monique was acutely aware that she had been placed under intense scrutiny, examined piece by piece from the very first moment. The young girl walked silently, her heart beating with a quiet sadness. Because Monique knew she couldn't stop those stares. They existed as an inevitable part of her life. A black girl out of place in an environment she didn't belong to. The only thing she could do was stay silent, endure, and hope that silence would be enough to get her safely through this final year. Monique had no intention of making friends, and certainly didn't want to stand out. All she hoped for was a peaceful year, graduation, and leaving this place without causing any disruptions. But as Monique walked deeper into the crowded hallways of Brighton High, she had no idea that all her quiet plans were about to be swept into a confrontation she had never expected. A confrontation that would not only test her inner strength, but change everything she thought she knew about herself. And it all began with this quiet moment. The first day Monique Jones set foot in Brighton High. As Monique walked past the row of light blue lockers, trying to find her locker number amidst the crowded hallway, she could feel the atmosphere around her shift. Suddenly, the chatter faded, and the lively conversations turned into hushed whispers. The students standing near Monique suddenly moved aside, almost instinctively, as if making way for someone approaching behind her. Monique didn't turn around, but her instincts told her that someone important had just arrived. Among the crowd parting, Ava Moore stood out. A tall white girl with long, perfectly curled blonde hair. The expensive plaid dress she wore hugged her slim 18-year-old frame, each step exuding confidence so intense it almost seemed to challenge the world around her. Ava wasn't just rich and popular at Brighton High. She was the one who shaped every invisible order here. A true power behind the classroom doors and school hallways. Ava never moved alone. Flanking her on either side were her two loyal best friends. Brooke, with fiery red hair and sharp eyes that quickly catalogued anyone who could cause trouble for Ava. And Clara, with dark brown hair, slightly shorter than Ava. The talkative one, but only speaking when necessary. A quiet but incredibly effective ally in gathering information around the school. But what truly made Ava's group untouchable at Brighton High wasn't just their money or the girls' striking looks. What mattered most was the presence of Zach Moore, Ava's older brother, the star of the school's football team. Zane was tall, with broad shoulders like a fortress, always wearing his famous number 12 sports jersey. He had an easy, natural smile, but his gaze always concealed an air of arrogance, a challenging look that made it seem like the entire school was within his grasp. Next to Zane, as a satellite ready to cause trouble on command, was Liam Rodriguez. Liam was lanky, with sharp, mischievous eyes that held an unpredictable cunning. No one knew for sure how close Liam was to Ava or Zane, but everyone understood that Liam was always ready to stir trouble just for the thrill of chaos. For him, causing trouble was a way to assert power. With her powerful group, Ava walked down the hallway like a queen entering her court. Every eye, every whisper was directed at them, a mix of admiration and fear. New students or anyone unaware quickly learned that if they wanted to survive at Brighton High, they had to know their place in the world Ava Moore had established. Monique glanced at Ava for just a moment, enough to catch the cold, arrogant gaze. Ava threw her way a look that was both assessing and silently warning. Monique instantly understood the meaning behind that glance. She was the new girl, and Ava was marking her place. This black girl was not allowed to cross the invisible line that had already been drawn. Monique looked down, continued unlocking her locker, purposely ignoring Ava's challenging stare. But inside her, a feeling of discomfort began to grow. Despite her efforts to avoid attention, staying silent and invisible as planned, Monique realized that she couldn't be completely unseen at this new school. The young girl quietly closed her locker, tightened the strap of her backpack, and walked toward her first class. But as she left the hallway, Monique distinctly sensed that this was just the beginning. Ava Moore and her group wouldn't stop at just a passing glance. Something deep in her instincts told Monique that she had unwittingly stepped into a world full of hidden dangers she hadn't anticipated. And at Brighton High, that silent power had only one name, Ava Moore. The first class passed slowly, and Monique chose a secluded spot in the corner of the classroom, where she could quietly observe everyone without drawing attention to herself. But no matter how hard she tried to avoid it, she could still easily catch the occasional cold, sharp glance from Ava, calculating as if she were silently planning something. For Ava Moore, Monique's arrival was the perfect opportunity to remind everyone who really held the power at Brighton High. Every year there were always new students, and there always had to be someone who became the target for Ava to solidify her position at the top of the social hierarchy here. Monique Jones, the girl from Chicago, with her quiet, reserved demeanor, was the perfect choice. Ava was always subtle in picking her prey. Too weak, a student wouldn't attract attention, but someone like Monique, silent, different, and standing out because of her silence was absolutely ideal. If she could break Monique, Ava would send a powerful message to the whole school. No matter who you were or where you came from, no one could exist outside of her control. Just a few hours after the first class ended, the quiet whispers began to spread behind Monique's back. At first, it was just harmless chatter like, "She's the new girl from Chicago. She looks kind of weird, doesn't she?" But before long, those whispers turned into malicious snickers. Monique could feel every word cutting through the air, hitting her ears like sharp little thorns. Though they weren't directed at her face, they were deliberately loud enough for her to hear clearly. Does she not know how to dress? Do people in Chicago all dress so tacky? She probably can't even finish a sentence properly. Monique kept her gaze fixed ahead, pretending not to hear the mockery, but her hand instinctively tightened around the pencil she was holding. She was far too familiar with the sting of such hurtful words, just because of her skin color, her background, or simply because she was the new girl. Monique knew that if she reacted, even in the slightest, it would only make things worse. Ava watched from afar, a subtle smile creeping onto her face as she saw Monique not responding to the teasing. To Ava, silence was a clear sign of weakness, and weakness was exactly what she needed to assert her position. Ava leaned in and whispered something to Brooke and Clara. Both girls immediately burst into loud laughter, deliberately directing their voices toward Monique, ensuring the other students around would notice even more. Amidst the chaotic noise, Monique remained still. She forced herself to breathe slowly, keeping her heartbeat steady, trying to push the discomfort growing in her chest. Monique knew that silence was the only option she had at that moment, but what she hadn't realized was that her silence, rather than soothing the situation, was unknowingly becoming a provocation to Ava. Ava despised indifference, because to her, Monique's refusal to react was like a silent challenge. Ava's pride and ego wouldn't allow a new student to come to the school and ignore her so easily. Ava Moore narrowed her eyes at Monique, a sense of curiosity mixed with growing frustration stirring inside her. Part of Ava found herself more intrigued by this game than ever before, because now Monique Jones was no longer just an easy target. She was a challenge, a puzzle that Ava had to solve. Monique quietly stood up when the bell signaling break rang, quickly walking out of the classroom. She still appeared calm, but in her mind one thought echoed sharply. Brighton High was not going to make it easy for her to have the peaceful year she had hoped for. Ava Moore had officially made her the target, and Monique knew full well that this game would not end with her silence. It seemed the longer Monique remained silent, the more impatient Ava became. She wasn't used to being ignored, and she certainly couldn't accept the existence of someone who could casually overlook the power she had worked so hard to establish at Brighton High. Monique, with her suspicious silence, had unknowingly triggered a deep, primal instinct within Ava, the instinct of a predator, eager to assert her dominance by taking down her prey completely. Lunchtime was always a special time at Brighton High. It wasn't just when the students gathered to eat, but also when the invisible power structures of the school were most clearly established. Who sat with whom, who spoke to whom, who was isolated, and who was sought after. Everything was subtly but unmistakably displayed in this environment. Ava, as the head of that unspoken food chain, always sat at the central table where all eyes could easily observe. She and her friends maintained a relaxed, haughty attitude, treating everything around them as a little performance for their entertainment. And today, Monique was the unwitting star of that performance. As Monique entered the cafeteria, she immediately noticed a few strange looks directed her way. It wasn't just curiosity, but an expectant gaze, as if they were waiting for something interesting to happen. Monique slowly made her way to the farthest table, the secluded corner no one wanted to sit at because it was so far from the center, and was often considered a spot for those who weren't welcome. But for Monique, it was the safest choice to avoid unnecessary attention. But today wasn't a normal day. Ava had already set a plan in motion to force Monique to break her uncomfortable silence. Ava didn't like waiting, and she certainly didn't like people like Monique, those who didn't immediately acknowledge the absolute power she held over this school. So Ava decided today she would teach Monique a small lesson, one enough to make the entire school remember that no one was allowed to underestimate her. Ava subtly tilted her head toward Brooke and Clara, signaling discreetly. Brooke immediately stood up, and along with Clara, they headed toward the far table where Monique sat. Ava smiled coldly, holding a full cup of juice in her hand. Slowly, she stood and walked after her two friends. Her stride was confident, each step exuding a clear message of power and defiance. Monique kept her head down, eating in silence, but instinct told her that something was coming very close. She could hear the footsteps drawing nearer, and when she looked up, her eyes locked with Ava's sharp, challenging gaze. A strange silence spread across the cafeteria. Students sitting at other tables immediately turned to watch, their silence so thick that Monique could hear the rapid beat of her own heart. Monique knew exactly what was about to happen, but she decided she wouldn't give Ava what she wanted, an angry or fearful reaction. Ava stopped right in front of Monique's table, her lips curling into a slight but malicious smile. She leaned forward, speaking softly but clearly enough for the entire room to hear. "Hi, you're looking a bit lonely, aren't you? Why sit all the way over here in the corner?" A quiet laugh erupted from Brooke and Clara, joined by the hesitant chuckles of the surrounding crowd. Monique remained silent, staring at Ava with an unnervingly calm gaze. Ava didn't wait for an answer, laughing lightly again before pretending to accidentally tip the large juice cup in her hand. The dark red liquid quickly spread, pouring over Monique's tray, staining her food, and dripping onto the table. Ava stood up straight immediately, feigning surprise and calling out in a falsely apologetic tone. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I spilled it." A burst of laughter filled the cafeteria. Curious and entertained eyes were all fixed on Monique, eagerly waiting for her dramatic reaction. But Monique didn't follow the script. The young girl simply sat still for a few seconds, then gently placed her spoon on her tray. Her gaze remained calm, showing no sign of anger or fear. Slowly, Monique stood up, picked up the tray now stained with juice, and calmly walked to the trash bin at the corner of the room, tossing the entire tray into it. Her movements were precise, without any unnecessary motions. The cafeteria fell silent. An eerie kind of silence that Ava had never witnessed before. No more laughter. No one dared to jeer. Monique's strange composure left everyone awkward, confused, and curious. As Monique returned to her seat to grab her backpack, she glanced at Ava once more. The look was cold, but not angry. Instead, it was eerily calm. So much so that it felt terrifying. It was a chilling calmness that Ava had never encountered before. Ava suddenly felt as though something had shifted in the game she had created. For the first time, a sense of unease washed over her clearly. She didn't understand where this reaction came from, but she knew one thing for sure. Monique was not the weakling she had assumed, and that realization made her feel deeply unsettled. As Monique left the cafeteria, a strange atmosphere enveloped everything. No one dared to speak, but everyone knew. Ava Moore's game might have just begun, but Monique Jones had officially become a far more unpredictable opponent than anyone Ava had ever faced before. That afternoon, after Monique left the cafeteria, Ava returned to her usual spot in the center of the lunchroom. She maintained her usual confident posture, back straight, eyes slightly lifted as if nothing unusual had just happened. But only she knew how fast her heart was pounding inside her chest. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Ava was used to the fact that whenever she took action, her targets would react clearly: anger, fear, confusion, even crying in front of the whole school. That was what she was waiting for. Complete submission to prove to the world who truly ruled Brighton High. But Monique Jones didn't respond that way. Not only did she refuse to submit, Monique didn't even react at all. The calm, indifferent attitude of the new girl, invisible in its presence, made Ava feel like she had pushed herself into an unfamiliar situation she had never faced before. For the first time in her life, she felt the absolute power she had built shaking, all because of someone who did nothing but remain silent. Ava glanced around the cafeteria. Soft whispers began to spread like a wave, gentle but loud enough to catch her attention. Quick glances, awkward murmurs that quickly disappeared when her eyes swept over them. For the first time, Ava felt that the curious, skeptical gazes of the crowd weren't directed at Monique, but instead were focused squarely on her. The powerful girl of Brighton High began to feel uncomfortable. Ava unconsciously tightened her grip on her water glass, her cold eyes turning toward Brooke and Clara, two friends who were always loyally by her side. Clara immediately avoided her gaze, pretending to be busy with her phone. Brooke gave a weak, awkward smile, as if she too felt uneasy about Monique's strange reaction. The familiar atmosphere had changed, and Ava could feel it. The faces that used to laugh and chat around her now seemed cautious, maintaining an odd distance as if they were trying to figure out what was really going on. Ava hated that. The curiosity, the skepticism. Those were things she was never accustomed to. Ava suddenly stood up, grabbed her bag, and walked out of the cafeteria. Brooke and Clara immediately stood up and followed. But Ava didn't stop to wait for them. She walked quickly down the school hallway, her cold gaze fixed on the familiar row of lockers. She had built her position at Brighton High by asserting her absolute superiority, by proving that no one could stand against the pressure she created. But now all of that seemed to pale in comparison to Monique's strange coldness. Ava knew the only thing that kept her power intact was the ability to make others submit. If that submission was threatened, her power would waver too. Brooke and Clara eventually caught up with Ava, walking silently beside her, afraid to speak a word. Brooke glanced at Ava and cautiously spoke up. "She isn't like the others, is she?" Ava furrowed her brows. That statement made her feel even more uncomfortable. Brooke had inadvertently confirmed her greatest fear. Monique was not just a normal student, someone who could be easily subdued like everyone else before her. Monique was different, and that difference was what made Ava feel unsettled for the first time. Ava suddenly stopped, turned to face Brooke, and coldly demanded, "What do you mean by that?" Brooke was caught off guard by Ava's reaction, quickly changing her tone and waving her hand in explanation. "I just mean, maybe she's just pretending, like acting tough, but inside she's really scared." Ava tilted her head, staring at Brooke for a long moment, then gently shook her head. A faint, ironic smile curled on her lips. "She's not scared. That's the problem." Ava said those words, and even she was surprised by her own admission. It made her feel even more uncomfortable. She had never allowed herself to admit that someone wasn't afraid of her. Acknowledging that would be like losing the power she had worked so hard to build. Clara cautiously chimed in, trying to ease the tension. "Anyway, Ava, maybe she just got lucky this time. In a day or two, everything will go back to normal. Who's going to stand up to you for long?" Ava let out a soft, bitter laugh, her gaze drifting down the hallway. But deep inside, the unease only grew stronger, like a dark cloud slowly overshadowing her mind more and more. Monique Jones might just be a new girl from Chicago, but that girl, with her silence and strange coldness, had made Ava doubt herself for the first time. Ava knew that if she didn't quickly put an end to this threat, her power would no longer be as solid as before. Ava walked on silently, but her heart was no longer calm. For the first time in her life, Ava Moore realized something she had always avoided. Maybe she wasn't as strong and powerful as she had always believed, and that feeling of unease was growing in her, quiet but intense. Ava wasn't used to this feeling of unease. The more she thought about Monique's cold, confusing attitude, the more she felt like she was losing control. It was uncomfortable, like a small cut that throbbed and spread each day. Not deep enough to make her stop, but impossible to ignore. Ava knew very well that if she didn't act more decisively, that feeling would only grow until even she couldn't control it anymore. And from that thought, Ava decided to escalate the game to a higher level. In the following days, the bullying of Monique began to unfold in a more systematic and noticeable way. From subtle whispers and light teasing at first, everything quickly escalated into more direct actions, deliberately creating clear pressure on her. Every class, every hallway, every moment Monique appeared, Ava and her friends always found a way to make Monique feel unwelcome at Brighton High. In class, Ava was always the instigator. She and Brooke often chose seats right next to Monique, intentionally whispering about fabricated stories meant to mock her loud enough for Monique to hear. Each word felt like a needle piercing Monique's mind, but she didn't react. Not once did Monique look up or show any sign of discomfort. She maintained her cold, steadfast demeanor, refusing to give Ava the satisfaction. That attitude once again made Ava's feeling of insecurity grow even more. So, she decided to take things even further. Gym class was always the time when Ava could most easily demonstrate her power, because the most prominent figure during this class was Zach Moore, her brother, the football team captain, who was admired by the entire school. With Zach's help, anyone Ava wanted to humiliate couldn't escape her sights. And this time, Monique would be no exception. Zach was tall, strong, with a confident look that made him appear like a professional athlete. He was always friendly with everyone, but everyone knew Zach would never refuse any request from Ava, no matter how cruel it was. For Zach, loyalty to his sister always came first. In today's gym class, as students gathered on the field, Zach gave a subtle glance at Liam Rodriguez, a troublemaker and close friend, who was always eager to join in bullying with a particular delight. Liam smiled slightly, immediately understanding what Zach wanted to do. As the class began, everyone quickly formed groups to warm up. Monique always chose a quiet corner away from attention, but this time, Zach and Liam made a point of walking over to her, casually standing right next to her in line. Ava watched from a distance, a cold smile flickering across her face as she saw Monique tense up ever so slightly. But Monique remained calm, her eyes straight ahead, trying not to acknowledge the two boys standing so close. This made Zach furrow his brows, surprised by the unusual calmness of this girl. However, he didn't stop. When the gym teacher instructed the students to start their warm-up run around the field, Zach immediately took the opportunity to get closer to Monique. He ran ahead, then suddenly slowed down, forcing Monique to dodge. Her foot stepped off course, but she quickly regained her balance, maintaining her pace. Zach grinned annoyingly, then repeated the action several times, deliberately obstructing Monique, forcing her to constantly adjust her stride and direction. Liam, stimulated by Zach's actions, quickly joined in the cruel prank. He kept pretending to bump into Monique's shoulder as he ran past. Each bump was strong enough to make Monique stumble slightly, but not enough to catch the teacher's attention. Monique felt each bump clearly, but she still didn't react. Her eyes stayed fixed on the path ahead, determined not to show any anger or weakness that Ava was waiting for. Monique knew that the only thing people like Zach and Liam were hoping for was a reaction from her, and she was determined not to give them that satisfaction. Ava watched closely from afar, scrutinizing every movement Monique made. The more she watched, the more she couldn't understand why Monique remained so calm. That cold attitude made Ava feel like she no longer had control of the situation as she thought. A moment of confusion and disappointment mixed inside Ava. For a brief moment, she wondered if she had misjudged Monique. Perhaps Monique was stronger than her fragile appearance suggested. But immediately, her pride caused her to dismiss that thought. She decided to continue, because Ava had never accepted losing easily. When gym class ended, Monique calmly left the field without a word of complaint. No angry look. That attitude only made other students start to look at Monique with a mix of surprise and admiration. Whispers spread around, and Ava could hear them clearly. That's strange. She didn't react at all. Monique is really different. Ava clenched her fist, her heart pounding, realizing that her game had gone much farther than she initially planned, because Monique Jones wasn't just silent to endure. She was silent to challenge Ava Moore's power. The feeling of power slipping through her fingers made Ava grow increasingly impatient. Every time Monique calmly walked past her subtle bullying, every time Monique maintained that cold, composed demeanor, Ava felt her pride being wounded more deeply. For Ava Moore, power at Brighton High was something she could never accept losing. Yet now it was Monique, a quiet, mysterious, and different girl who was directly threatening the position Ava had worked so hard to build. After a series of subtle bullying attempts and provocations that failed to achieve the desired effect, Ava knew it was time to escalate things clearly and decisively. She needed a direct blow, one strong enough to make Monique completely lose her composure. She wanted the entire school to witness Monique's public humiliation, so no one would ever dare question or doubt her power again. The perfect moment was always during lunch, when the cafeteria was the busiest and all eyes were focused on the center, watching every small interaction in this microcosm of society. Ava decided to use this familiar space as the stage for her final performance. This would be the last time she allowed Monique to maintain that insufferable calm. At lunch that day, Ava walked into the cafeteria with a composed yet icy expression, Brooke and Clara right behind her. Monique had taken her usual seat, the corner table at the back of the room, the place she always chose to avoid unwanted attention. But today, everything would be different. Ava had a clear, purposeful plan, and she was determined to carry it out perfectly. Ava walked directly to the center of the room where she usually sat, but her eyes remained fixed on Monique. The students nearby started to notice her, falling silent, curiosity building as they waited for something to happen. Ava stood up, carrying her tray, and pretended to casually pass by Monique's table as if it were a mere coincidence. But as she got only a few steps away from Monique, Ava suddenly increased her speed, deliberately bumping into Monique's shoulder with the full force of her body. The impact was strong enough to knock Monique's tray from her hands. A sharp, jarring noise echoed in the tense silence of the cafeteria as Monique's food scattered across the floor, a few drops of sauce splattering onto her pristine white shoes. Ava froze right in front of Monique, a challenging, victorious smile flashing briefly across her face. She shrugged exaggeratedly, her eyes gleaming with the smug pleasure of thinking she had finally succeeded in making Monique angry, or at least causing her to lose that cold, detached expression. "Oh, sorry. Didn't see you," Ava said loudly, her voice dripping with sarcasm, causing the students in the cafeteria to snicker nervously, as if it were an automatic reflex whenever Ava spoke. But just as quickly, the cafeteria fell into a dead silence. All eyes turned toward Monique, eagerly waiting for her reaction. Everyone was sure that this time, no matter how strong Monique was, she wouldn't be able to take it any longer. But what they witnessed next was completely the opposite. Monique didn't show any anger. She wasn't flustered, didn't panic, didn't rush to pick up the scattered food from the floor. Instead, she stood tall in a natural, strong posture, her eyes locked with Ava's, calm, transparent, as though she had seen through Ava's entire plan from the very beginning. Monique didn't say a word, but the gentle, mysterious smile that appeared on her lips held more power than any words could. That smile wasn't the smile of someone humiliated. It was the smile of someone in complete control of the situation, someone completely unaffected by childish games. Ava stared at Monique, a chill running down her spine. For the first time in her life, Ava truly felt a strange fear slowly spreading within her mind. Monique's gaze and smile made Ava feel like she was looking into something too deep, too mysterious, something she couldn't comprehend. Ava's hand involuntarily trembled. She couldn't look away from Monique's face. Her quiet, calm expression had now become a public challenge to the power Ava had always believed no one could doubt. A great doubt began to rise in Ava, making her feel more unsettled than ever. She began to wonder what Monique was really like. Was she truly fearless? Or was Monique simply unlike anyone Ava had ever bullied before? This sense of losing control made Ava feel increasingly afraid. Meanwhile, Monique remained standing in the same spot, her eyes never leaving Ava's, her smile still light, but filled with coldness and defiance. Ava finally had to look away. She quickly returned to her table, trying to hide her trembling hand. Whispers began to rise in the cafeteria, louder this time. "Oh my God! Did you see that? Monique's not scared at all. Ava, she's shaking, right?" Ava gritted her teeth, struggling to suppress the fear growing clearer inside her. She realized that the game she had started had completely spiraled out of her control. And for the first time, Ava Moore wondered if she could actually win against someone like Monique, a person who couldn't be subdued by the overwhelming force Ava had always prided herself on. The calm smile Monique used to respond to Ava in the cafeteria didn't last long. As she stepped out of the school gates, away from the curious stares and the whispers behind her, Monique felt her heart sink, pulling down the brief moment of confidence she had tried to project earlier. Beneath that cold exterior, a storm was quietly rising within the young girl. Monique never wanted to face situations like this again. Returning to the small house at the end of the quiet street where she lived with her father, Monique slowly entered the living room and collapsed onto the old familiar sofa. She raised a hand to cover her face, closing her eyes, trying to push away the heavy feeling weighing on her chest. Painful memories from her past, which she had always tried to avoid, suddenly flooded back, each detail vivid, as if it had happened just yesterday. Monique remembered the last time she lost control. It was 2 years ago at her old school in Chicago. A girl named Emma had provoked her for months, deliberately trying to anger Monique until she couldn't control her emotions any longer. In a brief moment, everything shattered. Monique reacted instinctively, using the martial arts techniques her father had taught her since childhood to defend herself. But she had misjudged her own strength. Emma ended up in the hospital with serious injuries, and Monique was forced to transfer schools to start over. Since that day, Monique had promised herself she would never lose control again. She didn't want to hurt anyone, especially not those who were trying to hurt her. But now, standing in the face of Ava's cruel jokes and increasingly aggressive provocations, Monique felt that promise was being seriously tested. She knew that if she kept silent and endured, there might come a time when she couldn't control herself anymore. The thought terrified her. Lost in her thoughts, Monique heard familiar footsteps approaching from the door. Her father, Mark Jones, had just returned from his martial arts training. Mark was a former professional fighter, once a rising star in the ring before an injury forced him to retire early. From a young age, Monique had been trained by her father, not only to defend herself, but also to develop inner strength and emotional control. Mark always taught his daughter that martial arts wasn't just about fighting, it was about facing challenges with calmness and self-control. Mark immediately noticed the unease on Monique's face as he entered the room. He set his bag down on the floor, walked over to sit beside her, and spoke in a warm, concerned voice. "What happened at school, sweetheart?" Monique opened her eyes, hesitated for a moment, then nodded slightly. She took a deep breath and began recounting everything that had happened at Brighton High, starting from her first day. Ava Moore's attention, the subtle bullying, the escalating provocations, and especially the incident in the cafeteria. Mark listened carefully to every detail, his face growing more serious with each word. When she finished, Monique lowered her head, her voice barely a whisper, as if she were trying to hide the weakness within her. "I don't know how much longer I can stay calm. I'm afraid that if this keeps happening, I'll lose control again, just like last time." Mark placed his hand on her shoulder, his gaze full of love, but also incredibly serious. "Monique, I understand your fear. I know you don't want to hurt anyone, but sometimes you can't control what others do to you. The only thing you can control is how you choose to face it." Monique looked at her father, her eyes filled with helplessness and doubt. "But if I react, I'll hurt someone. I don't want that to happen again, Dad." Mark gently shook his head, his voice firm yet calm. "You're misunderstanding, Monique. You don't start the fight, but you have to be the one to end it. Using martial arts doesn't necessarily mean hurting someone. It's about stopping the harm they want to cause you. Sometimes if you stay silent and keep enduring, others will think they can keep hurting you without consequences." He paused for a moment, then continued in a soft but strong tone. "I taught you martial arts so you could understand the value of strength and self-control. I know you're capable of controlling yourself, and I believe you won't let the past repeat itself. But I also want you to understand that you don't have to passively endure injustice forever. Sometimes responding appropriately is the only way to protect yourself and stop the harm for good." Monique sat quietly, listening to her father's words. Each sentence sank deep into her heart, awakening something that had been dormant for a long time. She realized her father was right. Remaining silent forever wasn't the solution. If she truly wanted peace, she would have to stand up and end the current situation herself. Mark gently pulled his daughter into an embrace. His voice was a tender whisper in her ear, yet firm. "I've always believed in you, Monique. Remember, your greatest strength doesn't lie in your fists, but in the choice of when to stand up and protect yourself." Monique closed her eyes slightly, a feeling of relief slowly rising within her. She understood now this battle wasn't something she had started, but she would be the one to end it decisively and calmly. And this time, Monique knew exactly what she had to do. The next morning, as Monique stepped into the familiar hallway of Brighton High, She immediately felt the shift in the atmosphere. Something was different, spreading through the quiet whispers and the curious eyes following her every step. Monique knew right away it was no longer just teasing. Something more serious was unfolding. A heavy feeling rose in her chest, but this time she wasn't uneasy like before. After her conversation with her father the night before, Monique was ready to face it all. Just a few steps in, Monique saw the cause of the special attention. A small piece of paper was taped to her locker. Monique slowly approached, clearly seeing the carefully handwritten yet provocative message. "After school today behind the gym, be there if you don't want to be called a coward forever. Ava Moore." Monique silently stared at the words for a long moment. Around her, other students stood in small groups pretending to be busy. But in reality, they were silently watching her reaction. Everyone knew this wasn't just an ordinary threat. This was a public challenge that Ava wanted everyone to witness. Monique understood clearly. Ava was once again asserting her absolute power, forcing Monique to either submit or back down. Monique gently peeled the paper off, folded it neatly, and calmly tucked it into her jacket pocket. Her face remained cold, showing no signs of fear or confusion, but inside Monique's heart, thoughts were rising stronger than ever. She knew this time she couldn't stay silent like before. Ava and her group wouldn't stop. They would never let up until they felt satisfied with their victory in front of everyone at the school. At that moment, from a distance, Ava slowly walked down the hallway, followed by Brooke, Clara, Zach, and Liam. Their footsteps echoed sharply in the strangely quiet space. Ava looked directly at Monique, a cold, challenging smile appearing on her lips. Her eyes gleamed with the usual confidence and arrogance she used to intimidate others. But this time, Monique didn't look away. She calmly met Ava's gaze, direct and determined. Ava stepped closer, stopping right in front of Monique, intentionally speaking loud enough for the surrounding students to hear. "I hope you'll show up, Monique. I'm tired of seeing your pathetic, fake, tough face. This time I'm going to teach you a lesson so you can understand your real place at Brighton High." Ava paused, her smug smile widening as she continued in a more mocking tone. "Of course, you could always choose to be a coward. Just not show up and keep running like you always do." Small laughs came from Brooke and Clara behind Ava, making the hallway feel more tense than ever. Monique still didn't respond immediately. Instead, she kept her cold, composed gaze fixed on Ava, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, but carried an undeniable power. "I'll be there." With that simple statement, the entire hallway fell into an absolute silence. Ava was slightly surprised. She hadn't expected Monique to accept the challenge so easily, but she quickly masked her surprise with a cold, confident smile. "Good. Don't disappoint me, Monique." "Now wait." Ava turned and walked away, but deep down a strange unease began to stir within her. Monique's calmness once again made Ava question what she was trying to achieve, but now she couldn't back down from the challenge. This power game had gone too far, and Ava knew better than anyone else this battle would determine her real position at Brighton High. As Ava and her group walked away, other students quickly scattered, whispering about what had just transpired. Monique stood alone in the hallway, taking a deep breath. She knew this decision would bring her closer than ever to the limits she had set for herself. But Monique had no other choice. She was tired of hiding, tired of letting others think they could hurt her without facing any consequences. Monique remembered her father's words from last night. "You didn't start this fight, but you have to be the one to end it." Now she understood that those words weren't just advice. They were a responsibility she had to take on herself. Monique didn't want to fight, but she couldn't let herself be knocked down again. Her heart began to calm. She slowly walked down the long hallway, determined and strong. A new sense of confidence began to stir within her, as though she had finally found the strength she had lost to her own fears. This afternoon, after school, behind the gym, Monique would stand up and face the biggest challenge she had encountered since stepping foot in Brighton High. She didn't know how this battle would end, but one thing Monique was sure of: she would never run again. That evening, The sky over Brighton was a dull gray, as if even the weather could sense the weight of the impending confrontation. Monique stepped out of her last class of the day with a quiet, burning determination in her chest. She walked down the school hallway, hearing the echo of each step she took on the tiled floor. Her heart beat fast, not from fear, but because she knew she was about to face something she had always avoided: a real fight, one where she couldn't stand on the sidelines any longer. As Monique turned the final corner of the hallway, the sports field behind the school came into view. A small crowd had already gathered, about 20 students, all whispering, anxiously waiting. Monique glanced at them, her eyes stopping on Ava Moore, the one standing right in the middle of the crowd with that familiar, challenging air. Ava stood tall, her arms crossed arrogantly in front of her chest, and behind her were Brooke, Clara, Zach, and Liam. All of them looked at Monique with curiosity mixed with excitement, clearly waiting for an entertaining show. Ava tilted her head slightly, a mocking smile appearing as Monique slowly walked closer. She took a step forward, her voice loud and clear, intentionally just loud enough for everyone to hear. "I thought you'd run away like the scared little mouse you are, Monique, but I'm glad you still have a little courage to show up." Soft giggles rippled through the crowd behind Ava, but Monique remained unmoved. She stared at Ava calmly and deeply, her face void of any expression. That look, calm and resolute, made Ava feel, for a moment, like something was off, as if she had just stepped into a situation beyond her control. But Ava quickly pushed that feeling aside. She smirked, raising her voice so that the whole crowd could hear her. "Today, I'm going to teach you a lesson that you'll remember for the rest of your life. You need to understand your place here, your place as someone no one wants to see." 1. Ava stepped forward again, closing the gap between them to less than 2 meters. A tense air surrounded the crowd, all eyes now fixated entirely on the two central figures. Monique stood still, looking straight into Ava's eyes with a coldness that was almost terrifying. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but carried such weight and determination that no one could ignore. "Ava, you'll regret doing this." Monique's warning, soft but powerful, made the whole space around them seem to freeze. The crowd instantly fell silent, no one daring to even breathe too loudly. Ava furrowed her brow, a vague sense of unease rising within her again. But her pride and arrogance wouldn't allow her to back down. She had to push forward to save face in front of everyone. "Oh, I'm so scared," Ava mocked, trying to hide the growing unease within her. She turned back to Zach and Liam, nodding slightly as if signaling that it was time to act. Zach and Liam immediately stepped up, standing behind Ava, their expressions full of challenge. Zach, tall and built like a football star, stood with his arms crossed, radiating a threatening presence. Liam, on the other hand, wore a mischievous grin, eager to engage in any sort of physical confrontation with particular enthusiasm. Ava believed that the pressure from her friends alone would be enough to make Monique back down without needing to resort to actual violence. But she was wrong. Monique stood her ground, showing no fear in the face of Ava and her group's pressure. She simply watched them silently, as if she had already foreseen everything that was about to happen. Ava grew frustrated and confused by Monique's chilling indifference. Her patience was starting to wear thin. "Enough, Monique. Who do you think you are, standing here challenging me?" Ava stepped forward, getting closer, her eyes filled with anger and frustration. Monique looked deeply into Ava's eyes once more, and in that moment, she knew there was no turning back. She remembered her father's words, "You don't start the fight, but you have to be the one to finish it." Monique understood that this was the moment for her to stand up, to defend herself in the clearest and most decisive way possible. "I warned you," Monique said slowly, each word clear and deliberate. "But if you still want to continue, then be ready for the consequences." "Hi." Ava felt a slight unease in her chest at Monique's confident words, but she still forced a calm expression and turned to address the crowd behind her. "See this? This little girl still thinks she can threaten me. The crowd's laughter rang out again, but this time it was weaker, almost hesitant. It seemed that even those around them were starting to feel the shift in the air. They began to wonder if Ava really had control of the situation. Monique stood firm, her gaze resolute and calmer than ever. She was no longer afraid, nor did she have any reason to avoid this confrontation. This fight wasn't something she had wanted, but it was happening, and she wouldn't allow herself to be knocked down again. The tense and heavy atmosphere enveloped the entire sports field behind the school. Everyone understood that what was about to happen in this moment would determine each person's fate and true standing, and Monique knew the final decisive battle had just begun. The tension in the air in the backyard of the school seemed to freeze for a moment before it exploded. All eyes fixed on Monique and Ava. In that brief instant, Monique stood still, her breathing steady, her gaze cold and unwavering as she looked directly at Ava, silently declaring that she would never back down again. Ava felt a surge of unease rise within her, but her pride and the pressure from the curious eyes around her pushed her to act. She glanced at Zach, and immediately he stepped forward with a confident, arrogant look on his face, believing that his superior strength would be enough to quickly end this confrontation. Zach moved closer to Monique, a defiant expression on his face. He didn't say a word, just smirked and raised his hand, aiming to shove Monique to the ground, a move he had used on countless opponents on the football field. But Zach had completely misjudged his opponent this time. In an instant, before Zach's large hand could touch her, Monique smoothly dodged with a quick, astonishingly agile move. She stepped to the right, lightning fast, and grabbed Zach's wrist, using his own strength and momentum to twist his body around. A second later, Zach felt his balance completely give way. Before he could process what had happened, Monique skillfully applied a pull and push technique, sending him crashing to the ground with a heavy thud. The sound of the impact was deafening in the complete silence of the crowd. Zach lay sprawled on the ground, gasping in astonishment. His eyes widened in disbelief at what had just occurred. A towering, powerful football player like him had been taken down effortlessly in a split second by a girl as small as Monique. The astonishment was clear on the faces of every student witnessing this. No one could have predicted such an outcome. Ava stood frozen, her face visibly pale, the fear she had felt becoming clearer than ever. But before she could regain her composure, Liam, still known for his love of stirring trouble, rushed forward with an angry expression, determined to restore his friend's honor. Liam said nothing. He charged directly at Monique, clenching his fist. But Monique, with the technique and calmness she had honed since childhood, was unfazed. She smoothly stepped aside just in time for Liam to rush past her. Her movements were as graceful as a dancer, but precise in every detail. She immediately seized Liam's wrist, spun her body around, and locked his arm behind his back with an incredible move. Liam screamed in pain as his arm was twisted into a very uncomfortable position. He struggled, but the more he moved, the more intense the pain became. Monique held onto his arm, not causing any further injury, but enough for Liam to understand that resistance was futile. Just a few seconds later, Liam had no choice but to kneel, his face contorted in pain and embarrassment. In that moment, the entire crowd stood still, their eyes wide with shock and amazement, unable to believe what was happening before them. Monique slowly released Liam's arm, calmly stepped back one step, her gaze still cold and unwavering as she looked at Ava, as if to affirm that she was not someone who could be easily defeated. For the first time in her life, Ava felt true fear creeping into her mind. She had never imagined that her power could be challenged this severely. Zach and Liam, two of her closest, strongest allies whom she had always relied on, were now lying on the ground, hurting and humiliated by the girl they had once looked down on. Ava's usual confidence quickly melted away, replaced by confusion and anxiety that grew with each passing second. Brooke and Clara stood behind Ava, too scared to step forward. They exchanged nervous, panicked glances. The crowd around them began to murmur, and this time they were no longer talking about Monique as a victim, but as someone who had shocked and impressed everyone. Monique remained standing, taking a deep breath to calm herself. She didn't feel triumphant for taking down Zach and Liam, but she knew this was something she had to do. She didn't want to hurt anyone, but she could no longer endure the senseless bullying. Ava stood facing Monique, trying to conceal her fear and loss of composure with her usual arrogant expression. But now, she could no longer maintain that facade. Her voice trembled, filled with anger and confusion. "You think you've won?" Monique looked at Ava, her gaze colder and clearer than ever before. Her voice rang out loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. "I warned you. You chose this fight, not me." That simple sentence felt like a splash of cold water to Ava's face. For the first time in her life, she realized there was nothing she could do to salvage this situation. The power she had once prided herself on was now crumbling in front of all the students in the school. In the absolute silence of the crowd, Monique slowly took a step back, her gaze still resolute and strong. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. She had officially ended this battle on her own terms. Monique had just turned to walk away, leaving behind the stunned silence of the crowd, when suddenly a scream of desperation and anger rang out from behind her. Ava, with her face contorted in a loss of control, was no longer calm enough to consider her image or her honor. What she saw before her eyes was an unacceptable sight, the bitter defeat she had never once imagined in her life. Rage surged within her, and Ava charged at Monique from behind, hoping that this surprise attack would help her regain whatever dignity she had left. But Ava was gravely mistaken. Monique had never let her guard down, as she had been trained too thoroughly to stay alert to any potential threat. As soon as Ava touched her back, in an instant as fast as lightning, Monique reacted with a perfect defensive move. She smoothly sidestepped, grabbing Ava's wrist and twisting her body to gently pull, causing Ava to lose her balance completely, nearly falling to the ground. But Monique didn't let Ava fall. She held her in an unsteady position, just enough for Ava to feel her own helplessness and utter failure. Ava stared in panic at the ground beneath her, her body trembling with fear and humiliation. This was the first time in her life that she truly felt how small and powerless she was. Once someone who believed she was strong, powerful, and invulnerable, she was now nothing more than a weak, struggling mess in the complete control of Monique. Monique leaned close to Ava's ear, her voice a cold whisper, clear and cutting like a sharp blade slicing into Ava's pride with finality. "You were never strong and you'll never control me." Those words were like a bullet to Ava's heart. They didn't just completely shatter her false confidence. They erased any illusion of absolute power that she had carefully built and protected at all costs. Ava shuddered, her breath quickened, her eyes wide with terror as the painful truth slowly sank deep into her mind. Monique slowly released her grip, gently letting Ava stand on her trembling legs. Ava staggered back a step, her eyes vacant as she stared into space. She glanced around, meeting the faces that once admired her, once feared her. But now all that remained was contempt and pity. A deep, unbearable pain spread throughout Ava's body. This was the moment when the power she once held so firmly had completely shattered before everyone's eyes. Brooke and Clara, who had always stood by Ava, now quietly stepped back, their eyes avoiding her, no longer willing to be involved. Even Zach and Liam, who had only just gotten up after their own humiliations, simply lowered their heads in silence, showing no sign that they were ready to protect Ava anymore. They had all abandoned her at the moment she needed them the most. Ava felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness engulf her. She had once believed power was everything, but now that power had completely vanished, leaving a massive void that she didn't know how to fill. Tears began to well up in her eyes, but she forced herself to hold them back, unwilling to break down any further in front of the people around her. Monique stood still, her gaze calm and cold, directed toward Ava. She didn't feel joy at Ava's failure, but she understood that this was necessary to finally end this senseless battle. She was no longer the one who had to endure, and Ava needed to realize that no one could control or bully others forever without facing consequences. Ava slowly stepped back, her legs heavy as if dragging thousands of stones behind her. Every eye watched her slow, defeated steps. She turned away and fled quickly, leaving the school grounds in the deepest humiliation she had ever felt. Her power had completely crumbled, and she knew that she would never be able to regain it. When Ava's figure disappeared from sight, the crowd began to murmur, a buzz of conversation rising like waves. But this time, the discussions were entirely different. They spoke about Monique with respect, with genuine admiration. Monique looked around and sighed softly in relief. Finally, she had done what her father always wanted: end the battle decisively and clearly, without causing unnecessary harm to anyone. Monique turned and walked away, leaving behind the schoolyard with an entirely different atmosphere. She knew that this battle had not only helped her rediscover herself, but also sent a powerful message to everyone who had witnessed it. True power never comes from threatening or dominating others, but from the strength within, from the courage and ability to face challenges without ever losing oneself. And that was the greatest victory Monique achieved in this battle. The next day, as the morning sunlight streamed through the windows and spread across the hallways of Brighton High, the entire school seemed to be immersed in an unfamiliar atmosphere that had never been felt before. If yesterday had been the day of Ava Moore's downfall, today was the day the entire school had to learn how to adjust to a new reality where all the old orders had completely disintegrated. Ava walked down the hallway with a heavy heart and a confused mind. Never before had she felt her steps so difficult, as if the familiar floor of this school had suddenly turned foreign. The gazes that had once feared, admired, and even kept their distance from her had now changed drastically. They were indifferent, avoiding her, or worse, filled with pity. This was a feeling Ava had never experienced before, and it was slowly eroding her once great self-esteem. She lowered her head, trying to avoid the scrutinizing glances around her. The whispers no longer carried admiration or fear. Instead, they were filled with curiosity mixed with fake sympathy. She quickly realized that the power she had spent years building and reinforcing had completely collapsed after just one afternoon. Now she was nothing but a faint shadow in the crowded hallway. Meanwhile, in another corner of the hallway, Monique walked into the school with a calm and natural expression, as though nothing had happened. She showed no signs of joy or smugness from yesterday's victory, for in her heart she had never seen it as a battle worth winning. Monique simply wanted to live peacefully, study normally, and not become anyone's target. But Brighton High no longer looked at Monique with cold or distant eyes. The students, who had once stood by, silently watching from afar, now began to look at her with a mix of admiration and curiosity. They didn't fully understand her, but they knew one thing for certain. Monique was not weak, and she was not someone who could be easily defeated by any pressure. A few students nodded as they greeted her when she passed, while others silently observed her with respect. Monique responded to all with a gentle, sincere smile, but she had no intention of taking Ava's place. Monique had never wanted to be the ruler or control others. She simply wanted to be respected and live life the way she chose. Not far from Monique, Ava stood silently by her locker, her hands trembling, her palms wet with sweat, as she clearly overheard the murmurs around her. Ava has really lost everything. I never thought she'd have a day like this. Yeah, from being a queen to becoming the laughingstock of the whole school in just one afternoon. Ava fought back tears, her heart aching as though being suffocated. She realized that the power she had once thought was endless was in fact fragile and could disappear so easily. Brooke and Clara, her once closest allies, now walked silently past her without saying a word. Even Zach, who had always been ready to protect his sister, now stood at a distance, looking at her with disappointment and helplessness. At the same time, Liam, who had always enjoyed causing trouble, now quietly stayed away from her, as if Ava was something he no longer wanted to be associated with. Ava realized the painful truth. The power she had relied on was entirely based on fear and fake admiration. Once that vanished, she had nothing but loneliness and shame. The more Ava's downfall became evident, the more uncomfortable Monique felt. She never wanted Ava to suffer the pain and isolation she had once endured. Even though Ava had been the one to hurt her, Monique understood all too well what it felt like to have the whole world turn its back on you. But Monique knew this wasn't her fault. Ava had chosen her own way of living, the way she treated others, and this outcome was simply the inevitable consequence. Monique couldn't change that reality, but she also didn't want to get caught up in the power struggle again. She was not Ava's successor, and she certainly didn't want to create a new power hierarchy. Monique gently walked down the hallway, keeping her gaze ahead, avoiding any curious eyes. But whether she wanted it or not, she had already become a new symbol at Brighton High, a symbol of courage, of the ability to stand firm against injustice without losing herself. Each step Monique took echoed in the school hallway like a clear affirmation. True power doesn't come from controlling others, but from inner strength and the ability to uphold one's own principles. While Ava tried to cling to the shattered remnants of her glorious past, Monique calmly continued down the path she had always believed in. Today marked an irreversible change at Brighton High. The collapse of false power and the rise of the genuine values that Monique represented. No one knew what the future would hold, but one thing was clear: Brighton High would never be the same again. The atmosphere at Brighton High gradually returned to normal after the recent events, but everyone knew one thing for sure. What had happened in the past few days had left an indelible mark in the minds of every student here. In this new order, Ava Moore was no longer the queen with absolute power, while Monique Jones, who had never craved power, had inadvertently become a symbol of true courage and strength. In the cafeteria during lunch that day, everyone was still whispering about the sudden changes at Brighton High. Monique sat alone at a table in the corner of the room as usual, not at all concerned about the curious stares directed at her. Meanwhile, Ava sat not far away, but no one sat with her. Her surrounding tables were completely empty. She sat silently, her eyes vacant as she stared at the tray of food in front of her, trying to hide the overwhelming sense of shame consuming her. Monique observed Ava's situation from a distance, feeling no sense of triumph. Instead, she felt a deep empathy, for she understood what it felt like to be lonely and isolated. After a moment of hesitation, Monique gently stood up, took her tray of food, and slowly walked toward the table where Ava was sitting. The entire cafeteria fell silent in an instant. Every eye was on the two girls, anxiously awaiting what would happen next. Ava slowly looked up, her eyes wide in surprise as she saw Monique standing in front of her. She couldn't say a word, her throat choking with shock and fear. Monique looked directly into Ava's eyes, her own gaze no longer filled with anger or hatred, but with a calm, clear strength never seen before. "It's all over now," Monique said softly but clearly, each word loud enough for everyone to hear. "I don't intend to continue this pointless fight. I hope you feel the same." "Oh." Monique's simple but powerful words echoed through the silent cafeteria. Ava froze, her body feeling as if it had turned to stone, and the humiliation and defeat engulfed her once again. But deep inside, Ava realized that Monique didn't want to humiliate her further. This was simply a clear, decisive declaration that it was time to move on. Monique didn't say another word. She turned and walked away, leaving Ava behind, along with the focused gazes of the entire school. Monique's steps were light and serene, without any sense of pride or arrogance. She simply left with the dignity of someone who didn't need victory, recognition, or power from anyone else. Ava sat frozen in place, the pain and shame overwhelming her in the prolonged silence. Those around her gradually turned away, continuing their meals in quiet whispers, leaving Ava to face the harsh reality of what she had just experienced. The power she had once believed to be invincible had completely vanished, leaving a void that Ava didn't know how to fill. As Monique stepped out of the cafeteria, she felt the gentle sunlight on her face, soothing the deep wounds she had once endured. She knew that life at Brighton High would now be easier, not just for her, but for many others who had suffered under the subtle oppression of the false power Ava once represented. But more importantly, Monique realized the true value of power and authority. True power was not in the ability to control, suppress, or bully others. It wasn't about proving who was stronger or who would be the final victor. True power was the ability to master oneself, to maintain one's self-respect and calm in the face of life's toughest challenges. When Monique walked away, no one doubted or gossiped about her silence and coldness anymore. All the students at Brighton High now understood that Monique never sought power in the way Ava had. Monique simply wanted to live a life where human dignity was respected, where no one had to endure harm from others for the sake of some illusory power. That profound message spread throughout the school, slowly sinking into the hearts of every student. Those who had once stood by silently, participated, or witnessed bullying began to reflect on themselves more seriously. Brighton High was no longer a place where power was built on fear and oppression. Now everyone understood that true strength was the courage to stand up and protect one's values, never allowing anyone to diminish or control them. The story of Monique and Ava became a valuable lesson that no one at Brighton High would ever forget. It reminded them that, no matter where they were or what the circumstances, the most important thing was the ability to remain true to oneself, to confidently face challenges without losing oneself to external pressures. And that is the truest form of power a person can have. The power of self-respect, courage, and inner strength that never bends before anyone. Monique's story showed us clearly that true strength does not lie in bullying or controlling others, but in the ability to maintain self-respect, resilience, and calm in the face of life's challenges. The greatest power each person can attain is the power to control themselves. And what about you? If you found yourself in Monique's shoes, how would you face the bullies? The days at Brighton High slowly settled back into rhythm. But beneath the surface, something had changed forever. The laughter in the hallways no longer carried the sharpness of mockery. Whispers no longer had the same venom. The invisible hierarchy that once ruled the school had dissolved, leaving behind a strange but liberating silence. Monique walked through the corridors with her usual quiet stride. She never raised her voice, never claimed victory, never sought to wear the crown that Ava Moore had dropped. For Monique, true triumph was not about ruling others, it was about finally learning to live without fear. Yet one afternoon, as the golden light of the setting sun streamed through the tall windows, Monique's steps slowed. By the row of lockers, Ava stood alone. Her once immaculate hair hung untended over her shoulders, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her books. Around her, students passed without notice. No whispers of admiration, no circle of loyal followers. She was a ghost in the very halls she once commanded. Monique paused, her eyes quietly studying the girl who had once been her greatest tormentor. For a fleeting moment, she saw not the tyrant who had tried to break her, but just another human being broken, lost, and trapped in the silence of her own downfall. Ava's eyes lifted, meeting Monique's gaze. There was no arrogance left, no icy command, only shame, and a faint, desperate glimmer of something unspoken, perhaps regret. Monique did not speak. She did not smile. She simply inclined her head ever so slightly, an unspoken acknowledgement, before turning away to continue down the hall. It was not forgiveness, nor was it cruelty. It was something far more powerful: release. In that simple gesture, Monique affirmed what she had learned through fire and silence. True strength was not in crushing an enemy, but in freeing oneself from hatred. As Monique disappeared into the glow of the afternoon light, Ava remained rooted by her locker, her chest tight, her eyes wet with tears. She no longer had the strength to hide. For the first time, she realized the depth of the void she had created around herself, and perhaps, buried under the rubble of her pride, the first fragile seed of change had begun to stir. Brighton High would carry on. Students would laugh, study, dream, but they would never forget the days when silence spoke louder than cruelty, when dignity broke the chains of fear. And in that memory, Monique Jones's story lived on. Not as the tale of a fighter who defeated a bully, but as the lesson of a girl who taught an entire school the meaning of true power. The echoes of what happened at Brighton High did not fade quickly. Even after the tension dissolved and the classrooms filled again with the normal rhythm of teenage chatter, something invisible remained, a shift that no one could quite name, but everyone felt. For days, students walked the halls with a strange, quiet reverence, glancing at the lockers, the cafeteria tables, the corners of the gym, the battlegrounds where silence and cruelty had clashed. Whispers spoke of Monique not as a victim anymore, but as a symbol. She had not shouted, she had not retaliated with the same poison she had been fed. Instead, she had chosen a strength rooted in self-control and dignity, and that changed everything. But beyond the thrill of a fight won, the deeper story of Monique Jones carried a truth that reached far outside the red brick walls of Brighton High. It was a truth that speaks to every community, every classroom, every street, where difference becomes a weapon, and where silence too often becomes complicity. Bullying rarely begins with fists. It begins with whispers, with stares, with the quiet math of exclusion: who is invited, who is ignored, who is treated as less. For Monique, those first days were not about spilled juice or physical shoves. They were about the piercing sound of laughter aimed at her skin, the cutting tone of voices that asked if someone like her belonged. That is how racism works when it hides in plain sight. Not always with slurs shouted across playgrounds, but with the accumulation of small humiliations, the mocking of an accent, the judgment of a hairstyle, the way teachers' eyes slide past the raised hand of a child who does not fit the majority's image of brilliance. Each act seems trivial on its own, but together they form a prison as real as steel. Monique endured this not just in Brighton, but in every school before. She carried that burden quietly, until silence became her armor. Yet what her story revealed is that silence alone cannot dismantle cruelty. At some point, dignity demands a voice, even if that voice does not come in words but in action, the refusal to be broken, the courage to stand upright even when the crowd waits for collapse. There is a lesson here for every young person who has ever walked into a cafeteria and felt the room grow heavy. There is a lesson for every teacher, every parent, every neighbor who has turned away because kids will be kids. The truth is simple but uncomfortable. When we allow the was of the world to thrive, we become accomplices in their cruelty. When we excuse their behavior as popularity games or teenage drama, we let fear and prejudice harden into power, and that power can destroy lives. Yet the story of Monique reminds us that the cycle can be broken, not with revenge, not with cruelty in return, but with a strength that says, "You will not define me, you will not own me, you will not teach this community to fear me for the color of my skin, the sound of my voice, the difference of my heritage." This is what makes her story more than a schoolyard drama. It is a mirror for our societies, our workplaces, our politics, places where discrimination still hides behind polite smiles or behind the silence of those who see but choose not to speak. What would happen if every community taught its children that power does not come from domination, but from empathy? What would happen if, instead of rewarding arrogance, we celebrated resilience? If we raised our voices not only when we are the targets, but also when we are the witnesses? Imagine classrooms where teachers intervene not only against physical fights, but against the jokes whispered under breath. Imagine hallways where students do not laugh nervously at cruelty, but walk toward the one who sits alone. Imagine schools where the courage to defend someone different is seen not as rebellion, but as leadership. This is not idealism, it is survival. Because each time a Monique is forced into silence, the message spreads to countless others. Be quiet, be invisible, or you will be next. And each time a Monique stands tall, the message flips. You matter, you belong, and no one has the right to erase you. Ava's downfall was not simply about one bully losing her crown. It was about an entire school witnessing the fragility of false power. The students saw what happens when cruelty becomes the foundation of authority. It crumbles, inevitably. They saw that fear does not last forever, that admiration built on intimidation is not admiration at all. And perhaps most importantly, they saw that racism and bullying are not unstoppable forces. They are choices. And because they are choices, they can be unchosen. For you who have listened to this story, the question now is not about Monique or Ava. It is about you. When you see someone mocked for their skin, will you stay silent? When you hear the venom hidden in just a joke, will you laugh along, or will you say that cruelty in disguise is still cruelty? When a new student walks the hallways of your school, your workplace, your community, will you offer suspicion or welcome? True change does not begin with governments or principles. It begins with the tiny acts of ordinary people who refuse to participate in the old order of fear. It begins with someone like you deciding that courage, empathy, and dignity are the new rules of survival. Monique's story is now part of Brighton High, but its lesson belongs everywhere. It is a call to stand against racism, not only when it burns brightly in acts of violence, but when it flickers quietly in the jokes we excuse, the looks we ignore, the silence we let linger. If you carry anything from her journey, let it be this. True power is not the ability to control others, but the ability to master yourself, to respect the dignity of others, and to build a community where no one has to shrink in order to survive. And now, I turn to you. What did Monique's story awaken in you? Did it remind you of a time when you were silent, or when you found your strength? Did it make you think of someone in your school, your family, your neighborhood who still waits for a defender? Share your thoughts in the comments. Not because engagement matters, but because stories only breathe when voices answer them. If you believe in spreading stories like Monique's stories that challenge cruelty and lift courage, consider joining us here at Raw Black Stories. Subscribe, not for numbers, but to help us build a community where every voice, every difference, every story can be honored. Because in the end, we are all walking the hallways of one larger school, the world itself. And whether it becomes a place of fear or a place of dignity depends in no small part on what we choose to do next.